a rancher's mail-order bride surprise. She was Chinese and didn't speak English. The wind swept endlessly across the rolling plains, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and dust. Miles of open land surrounded a small, weather-worn ranch house that stood like an island in a sea of grass. Inside lived Samuel Carter, a man in his early 30s whose broad shoulders and calloused hands spoke of years of hard labor. His days began before dawn and ended long after the sun had slipped below the horizon. He was a man who knew the rhythm of the earth and the habits of cattle far better than the sound of another human voice. Life on the frontier was not easy, and it was lonelier still for someone without family. Samuel's parents had died of fever when he was young, leaving him the land and little else. Over the years, he had built up a modest herd of cattle and a reputation for being reliable. But even with these small successes, the ranch remained silent. His only companion was an old dog who slept near the hearth. In the evenings, after the work was done, Samuel would sit in the creaking wooden chair by the window, staring out at the setting sun. He would sip his coffee and listen to the cry of the night birds, but there was no one to answer his thoughts, no one to share the small victories or the heavy burdens. It wasn't that Samuel disliked people. When he rode into town for supplies, he was polite to everyone and exchanged small talk with the shopkeepers. But he had never found anyone who felt like home, anyone who could fill the quiet spaces of his life. Women in the nearby settlements were few, and most were already married or uninterested in the hard life of a ranch wife. His ranch was too far from town, too rugged, and his own manner too shy to charm anyone easily. Yet Samuel longed for more than just survival. He wanted a partner, someone whose laughter would warm the cold nights, whose hands might help tend the garden or mend torn shirts, someone who would make the house feel less like a shell and more like a home. As the years passed, the ache of loneliness grew heavier, a weight he carried as surely as the saddle on his horse. It was during one of his rare visits to town that he noticed a flyer pinned up on the notice board outside the general store. The paper was slightly curled from the wind, but the words were clear. Mail-order brides. Honest young women seeking marriage and a new life in the West, inquire within. Samuel read it twice, heart-thudding. He had heard of such arrangements, though he'd always thought them desperate or risky. But as he folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket, he felt a flicker of hope. Back at the ranch, Samuel spent several nights thinking about it. He pictured the empty chair across from him at the table, the quiet bedroom upstairs, the garden that could be full of flowers instead of weeds. He wrote a letter carefully, choosing each word to describe his life honestly, the long hours, the rough conditions, but also his steadiness, his hopes, and the small comforts he could offer. He mailed it and then waited. Weeks passed. When at last he received a reply, his hands shook as he opened the envelope. The letter came from a woman named Elizabeth who lived back east. She wrote in neat script about her upbringing, her dreams of starting fresh, and her willingness to work hard. Her words were warm and kind, and though they had never met, Samuel felt a strange connection as he read. They exchanged several letters over the following months, each one revealing more of their lives, their hopes, and their plans. By the time he received her final letter confirming her travel, Samuel felt a mix of excitement and nervousness he hadn't known since boyhood. He cleaned the house from top to bottom, patched the roof, and even bought fresh curtains from town. For the first time in years, the ranch felt alive with anticipation. He imagined Elizabeth's smile, her voice, the way her presence might change everything. Out on the plains, the wind still blew, but in Samuel's heart, a quiet hope had begun to grow. Soon he believed his solitude would end. Soon he would no longer be alone. In the weeks that followed Elizabeth's last letter, the ranch seemed to take on a different tone. Samuel woke before dawn, as always, but there was a lightness in his step now. Where once his chores were a relentless cycle, now they felt like preparation. Each fence post repaired, each bucket of water drawn, each saddle oiled carried a quiet sense of purpose. He wasn't just maintaining a ranch anymore. He was preparing a home. Samuel's imagination, usually tucked away under layers of routine, began to roam. While riding the fence line, he found himself picturing a figure walking beside the corral, a woman in a bonnet shading her eyes, smiling at him. When he milked the cow in the cool of the morning, he imagined laughter echoing from the kitchen. These visions were fragile, like mist, but they warmed him against the biting wind. Inside the house, he undertook a kind of quiet renovation. The spare room, which had long been a storage place for old tools and crates, became his project. He cleared it out, swept the floor, and set up a simple bed frame with a clean mattress. He bought a quilt from a widow in town who stitched bright flowers into the fabric. On his last trip for supplies, he even splurged on small things he thought a woman might appreciate. A mirror framed in wood, a set of porcelain cups instead of his tin mugs, a hairbrush. They sat on the shelf like promises of a different life. Samuel's old dog, Ranger, seemed to sense the change too. He followed Samuel more closely, cocking his head at the rearranged furniture and the smell of freshly scrubbed floors. At night, while Samuel sat at the table writing a last-minute letter of instructions for Elizabeth's arrival, Ranger lay at his feet as if guarding the flicker of hope that filled the room. Despite the excitement, Samuel felt a ripple of nervousness beneath his anticipation. He had never been much of a talker, and the idea of welcoming someone he had only met through letters felt like standing at the edge of an unfamiliar canyon. What if she found the land too barren, the work too hard, or the man too plain? What if she took one look at the ranch and regretted everything? In the darkness before sleep, doubts crept in like coyotes at the fence line. But the next morning, as he watched the sunrise spread gold over the grasslands, his doubts would lift. The light reminded him that he had survived storms, droughts, and loneliness. He could weather uncertainty, too. The idea of sharing his life with someone, or even a stranger, was stronger than his fears. As the day of her arrival drew nearer, Samuel's preparation became almost ceremonial. He took his best shirt, a white one reserved for Sunday, and washed and ironed it himself. He trimmed his hair with the old scissors and polished his boots until they gleamed. He even tried his hand at baking a pie, remembering a recipe from his mother, though the crust came out lopsided. He didn't care. It felt good to try. On the morning he was to meet her, Samuel rose before the sun. He fed the animals quickly, saddled his horse, and set out toward the town, with Ranger trailing behind for part of the way before turning back. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and new grass. As he rode, he rehearsed what he might say, a greeting, a compliment, a welcome. His heart beat faster with every mile. When the small town finally came into view, the train's smoke already curled above the station. He could hear the distant hiss of brakes as it slowed to a stop. This was the moment he had been living toward for months. He dismounted, brushed the dust from his coat, and joined the small crowd on the platform. Families reunited, travelers stepped down, porters shouted. Samuel's eyes scanned the passengers, searching for the woman whose letters he had read so many times he almost knew them by heart. Somewhere among the strangers was his bride-to-be, the woman he believed would transform the lonely house into a home. He stood tall, trying to keep his hands from trembling. The whistle blew again. Steam enveloped the platform, and his heart pounded like a drum. Steam from the train curled through the morning air, drifting across the platform like thin fog. Samuel adjusted the brim of his hat, scanning each face as passengers stepped down one by one. He had memorized the description Elizabeth had given in her letters. Brown hair pinned neatly, a blue dress carrying a small trunk. He rehearsed her name silently, ready to speak it aloud with a smile. Women in travel-worn clothes passed him, greeting relatives or following porters. A group of children darted around, laughing. Samuel's heart beat faster each time a young woman appeared, then sank again when she moved on to someone else. Minutes stretched. The platform began to empty. Still no sign of Elizabeth. Then, near the end of the crowd, a figure stepped down onto the platform. A young woman with glossy black hair coiled beneath a plain hat. Her dress was modest and travel-stained, her eyes dark and alert. She clutched a small bundle wrapped in cloth and looked around nervously, as if she didn't know where to go. Something in her expression made Samuel pause. She was clearly alone, clearly searching. Their eyes met briefly. She said something in a language Samuel didn't recognize, the words soft and hurried. He blinked, confused, and stepped closer. "Elizabeth?" he asked. She tilted her head, not understanding. He tried again, slower. "Miss Elizabeth, from the letters?" The young woman shook her head slightly. She pointed to herself and said a name. It sounded like Mei Lin, then gestured toward the bundle at her feet and back to the train as if to explain. Her voice was musical, but the meaning lost on him. A cold realization swept through Samuel. This was not Elizabeth. This was someone else entirely. A stranger, a Chinese woman who didn't speak a word of English. He felt his stomach tighten, his carefully built anticipation collapsing. Yet the woman, Mei Lin, did not turn away. She looked at him with a mixture of worry and hope, as if she too expected someone to be here for her. Around them, the platform emptied further. The train's whistle blew again and porters began loading baggage. She said something else, this time gesturing to a crumpled paper in her hand. Samuel took the paper. It was a letter written in halting English, apparently from an agency back east. The words were stilted but clear enough. Mei Lin had been arranged as a mail-order bride for a rancher named Samuel Carter. She had traveled thousands of miles under the promise of a husband, a home, and a new life. He stared at the letter, stunned. This wasn't what he'd arranged, at least, not what he thought he'd arranged. Somewhere, somehow, letters had been crossed, names mixed, or an agency had substituted one bride for another. He felt anger rising, but also confusion. This woman had traveled halfway across the world, believing she was wanted here. Mei Lin shifted from foot to foot, clutching her bundle. The uncertainty in her eyes cut through Samuel's anger. She was far from home, unable to speak the language, surrounded by strangers. He imagined what it must feel like to stand on a platform in a foreign land with no one to understand you. Samuel let out a long breath. He could not simply leave her there. Whatever mistake had been made, she was now his responsibility. At least for the moment. All right, he murmured, more to himself than to her. We'll figure this out. He picked up her bundle and gestured toward his wagon. Mei Lin hesitated, then followed, her steps small and cautious. The ride back to the ranch was silent but heavy with unspoken questions. Samuel gripped the reins, staring ahead at the road. This was not the future he had pictured, not the woman he had imagined sharing his table. Yet beside him sat a human being who had taken a leap of faith as great as his own. As the town disappeared behind them and the plains stretched wide, Samuel felt the full weight of what had just happened settle onto his shoulders. The life he had been preparing for was no longer the one arriving at his door. The wagon jolted over ruts in the dirt road as Samuel guided the team of horses back toward his ranch. Dust curled up from the wheels and drifted in the sunlight. Beside him, Mei Lin sat stiffly, her bundle clutched tightly against her chest. She glanced around at the open plains with wide, unreadable eyes. Samuel wanted to say something, anything, but every phrase he rehearsed died in his throat. What could he tell her? That she was a mistake? That she had come to the wrong man? That he didn't even know how to talk to her? The ranch house came into view at last, small and solitary against the rolling land. Samuel felt a twinge of embarrassment. He had polished and cleaned every corner for Elizabeth, but now he wondered what Mei Lin would see. A barren cabin, a rough man, and a future she couldn't possibly have imagined. He pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down, then offered his hand to help her. She hesitated, then placed her fingers lightly in his palm, eyes still darting nervously. Inside the house, the silence was heavy. Samuel gestured toward a chair, then set her bundle on the floor. Mei Lin perched on the edge of the seat, hands folded, back straight. Her hat was still on, as though she wasn't sure if she was allowed to remove it. Samuel poured water into a tin cup and slid it across the table to her. She accepted it with a small nod but did not drink right away. He cleared his throat. My name is Samuel Carter. He pointed to himself. Samuel. Mei Lin blinked, then repeated softly, Samuel. He nodded. Yes, Samuel. He pointed to her. You? She hesitated, then touched her chest. Mei Lin, he repeated. She gave a faint smile, the first he had seen, and for a moment the tension eased. But as soon as he tried to explain more, the barrier rose again. Words were useless. She tilted her head, not understanding, and he felt the frustration creep in. For days that followed, the house felt like a stage for two actors reading different scripts. Samuel rose at dawn to tend the animals, expecting help in the kitchen or the yard. Mei Lin, unsure of what to do, moved quietly from room to room, trying to guess his needs by watching. Sometimes she tried to cook using the few ingredients she recognized. Other times she sat by the window, sewing or mending her own garments. Their efforts collided more often than they aligned. He'd come in hungry from the fields to find an unfamiliar stew that smelled of spices he wasn't used to, and she would look at him anxiously, waiting for his reaction. At night, they ate in awkward silence. Samuel tried simple words, pointing and naming things, Table, window, horse, and she repeated them carefully, her accent soft. She responded with words in her own language which he couldn't repeat properly. A few times they both laughed at the clumsy attempts, but more often the distance between them felt as wide as the plains outside. Neighbors noticed quickly. When Samuel rode into town for supplies, people asked questions. Who was the foreign woman he'd brought back? Where was the bride he had been expecting? Some comments carried curiosity. Others carried judgment. Samuel felt the weight of their looks. He didn't know how to answer them. He barely knew how to answer himself. Yet in the midst of the confusion, small glimpses of connection appeared. One evening, when a storm rolled over the prairie and rain pounded the roof, Mei Lin lit a small candle and set it between them at the table. She murmured something in her language and pushed a bowl of warm broth toward him. He accepted it wordlessly. The gesture was simple but steadying, like a bridge across a deep river. Still, the clash of expectations hung in the air. Samuel had imagined a partner who could step easily into his life, who shared his tongue and his customs. Mei Lin had likely imagined a husband who greeted her with certainty, who knew her language or her ways. Instead, they found themselves in a house filled with misunderstandings, each of them a stranger in their own story. Samuel lay awake many nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering what to do. Send her back, ask the agency for help, or keep trying, hoping the gap between them could be crossed. Each choice felt heavy, but each morning when he saw Mei Lin quietly tending to some small task, sweeping the floor, folding his shirts, leaving a bowl of tea at his elbow, something in him softened. The situation was not what either of them had expected, but it was real, and it was theirs to face. The first fragile bridge between Samuel and Mei Lin began not with words but with small, almost invisible acts. By mid-spring, the days stretched longer, and Samuel noticed how Mei Lin had quietly rearranged the kitchen shelves, lining the jars neatly, tucking dry herbs into small cloth pouches. He'd come in from the fields to find water already heating on the stove for coffee, or a towel laid out for him without being asked. At first, these gestures unsettled him. He wasn't used to anyone anticipating his needs, but over time they became a quiet rhythm, like the steady beat of hooves under a long ride. In return, Samuel started looking for ways to ease her adjustment. He carved a small wooden stool so she could reach the high shelves. He brought her wildflowers from the pasture and set them in a jar on the table, unsure if she liked them but hoping she might. He slowed his movements when showing her how to do ranch tasks, using his hands more than his voice. When she tried to mimic him, he offered a patient smile instead of the frustrated sighs he'd given in the first weeks. They began to develop their own patchwork language, half English, half gestures, half expressions. Water became a tilt of the pitcher. Horse meant miming reins with their hands. Sometimes they drew in the dirt or on scraps of paper. He'd sketch a cow, she'd sketch a chicken, then point and nod. It wasn't smooth, but it was theirs. One evening, Samuel returned late, weary from rounding up strays after a sudden thunderstorm. Mud streaked his boots and a cut ran across his forearm where a branch had whipped him. As he sat heavily at the table, Mei Lin approached silently with a basin of warm water. Without a word, she set it before him, dipped a cloth, and began to clean the cut. Her touch was light but sure. He started to protest on, "I'm fine," but stopped. The look in her eyes was not pity but calm concern. For the first time, he let someone else tend to him. That small moment cracked something open. The next morning, he found a paper on the table where she'd drawn a sunrise and a small figure on horseback. Beside it, in careful English letters, she'd written, "You strong. Thank you." He carried that scrap of paper in his breast pocket all day. Outside, spring pushed its way across the plains, grass greening, calves bawling in the pens, the smell of fresh earth rising after rain. Samuel began taking Mei Lin out with him more often. He showed her how to scatter grain for the chickens, how to hold a calf steady while he checked its hooves. She learned quickly, her movements precise and deliberate. Once, while she was filling the trough, a startled colt danced too close, and Samuel instinctively reached out, steadying her shoulder. Their eyes met. She gave a small laugh, the first real laugh he'd heard from her, and something inside him lightened like sunlight breaking through clouds. They still stumbled often. Sometimes she cooked meals heavy with spices he couldn't identify, and he'd take a cautious bite, making a face that made her giggle. Sometimes he'd use a word she misunderstood and they'd both end up exasperated. But the tension of the early days softened into something more forgiving. Evenings grew warmer. They'd sit outside after supper, he smoking his pipe, she mending clothes, or simply watching the horizon. The silence between them began to feel companionable rather than awkward. Samuel noticed changes in himself too. He spoke less sharply, listened more. He began to imagine not just a partner he'd ordered from an agency, but a person beside him with her own courage, her own story, her own leap of faith. He wondered about her family, her past, what dreams had carried her this far. He couldn't ask yet, but he hoped one day he would. As the sun dipped behind the hills one evening, Mei Lin handed him a small cup of tea she'd brewed from leaves she'd brought from home. The scent was unfamiliar, floral and earthy at once. Samuel raised it to his lips, met her eyes, and nodded. She smiled, a small, genuine smile. And for the first time, the space between them felt less like a chasm and more like a path slowly being built from both sides. By early summer, the prairie had shifted from pale green to a deeper, sun-baked gold. Samuel and Mei Lin had fallen into a tentative routine. She kept the house and helped with lighter chores. He handled the heavier work outside. Their gestures and shared tasks had begun to feel less like guesswork and more like habit. Yet beyond the boundaries of the ranch, a different kind of pressure was building. The first hints came in town. When Samuel rode in for flour or nails, he'd notice how conversations paused when he entered the store. People who once greeted him with easy nods now offered guarded looks. A few asked openly about the foreign woman living at his place. Others spoke in half-joking tones about mail-order surprises. Samuel answered curtly, paying his bill and leaving quickly. He wasn't ashamed of Mei Lin, but the scrutiny gnawed at him. One afternoon, as he loaded feed onto his wagon, a neighbor named Collins leaned against the rail and said, "Didn't figure you for the type to bring in one of those. You sure about this, Carter? Folks are talking." His tone carried more warning than curiosity. Samuel forced a tight smile and kept stacking the sacks. "She's my concern," he said simply. Collins gave a shrug, muttered something under his breath, and sauntered off. Back at the ranch, Mei Lin sensed the tension without needing words. She would glance up from kneading dough to find Samuel brooding by the window, or see the way his jaw tightened after returning from town. Once she tried to ask, pointing to him, then to the horizon, then frowning, but he only shook his head, not wanting to burden her with gossip she couldn't understand. Complications arose closer to home, too. Because she spoke little English, Mei Lin couldn't explain herself to visiting riders or passing drovers. More than once, Samuel came back from the pasture to find a stranger at the door, asking who she was or why she was there. She'd stand silent, clutching her apron until Samuel arrived. Each encounter left her more anxious, him more protective. There were practical hurdles as well. Samuel realized he had no official papers proving any arrangement with the agency. The letters from Elizabeth and the one accompanying Mei Lin's arrival were all he had. Without a marriage certificate, Mei Lin's position in the territory was precarious. She had no friends, no family nearby, and no legal standing if someone decided to challenge her presence. Even within their fragile partnership, the stress showed. Samuel found himself snapping when chores went undone or when she tried to follow him into dangerous work. Once, after she startled a skittish mare and nearly got kicked, he raised his voice in a burst of fear disguised as anger. She flinched, set down the bucket she was holding, and disappeared into the house for hours. That night he stood outside the closed bedroom door, ashamed. He didn't know how to tell her he was scared for her, not angry, yet for every obstacle small signs of solidarity appeared. When neighbors made remarks within earshot, Mei Lin would lift her chin and keep walking, refusing to shrink. When Samuel returned from town sullen, she would leave a small bowl of tea at his place on the table, a silent offering of comfort. Little by little, the two of them began to form an us against the world, even if neither could name it. Still, Samuel knew the situation couldn't remain indefinite. Gossip was one thing, legal trouble was another. He began writing letters to the agency in the evenings, asking for clarification, for papers, for anything that would make Mei Lin's status secure. Each time he sealed an envelope, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavier. On the nights when the prairie wind moaned around the corners of the house, Samuel lay awake listening to her soft breathing in the next room. He thought about the distance she had traveled, the courage it had taken and the risk he was asking her to live with now. Whatever lay ahead, they would have to face it together. Not just the work of the land, but the judgment and obstacles of the world beyond their fence line. The summer sun had burned the prairie grass to brittle straw. Clouds gathered on the horizon, heavy and greenish, the kind that signaled a hard storm. Samuel could smell rain and electricity in the air as he worked to herd his cattle closer to the barn. He glanced back toward the house where Maylene was bringing in laundry from the line, her hair whipped by the rising wind. He had written yet another unanswered letter to the agency the night before. The uncertainty, the gossip, and the long days had left him wound tight, a coil of worry and fatigue. But when the wind shifted and he saw the sky boil darker, instinct pushed everything else aside. A storm like this could rip a roof clean off and scatter the herd. "Stay inside," he shouted, pointing toward the house. Maylene looked up at the sky, then back at him. She nodded and disappeared through the door as the first fat drops of rain hit the dust. Within minutes, the storm broke with a roar. Rain hammered the earth and thunder rolled like a drum. Samuel fought to close the barn doors against the gusts. As he pushed the last gate shut, a sharp cry cut through the wind. He turned. Through the curtain of rain, he saw Maylene running toward him, skirt plastered to her legs, clutching something close to her chest. The old dog, Ranger, trembling and soaked. A section of the chicken coop had blown loose and she had rushed out to rescue the animal before it collapsed. "Get back!" he yelled, but the wind tore his voice away. A flying branch whipped past her shoulder. Without thinking, Samuel sprinted through the mud and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the barn. Together they stumbled inside, slamming the door behind them. Rain drummed on the roof like stones. For a moment they just stood there, breathless, soaked, hearts hammering. Ranger whimpered in her arms. Samuel took the dog gently, set him down, and then turned to Maylene, words spilling out rough and urgent. "You could have been hurt. You can't—" He stopped himself. She was shaking, eyes bright not with fear but with defiance. She said something sharp in her own language, then pointed to the dog, then to herself, then to him. The meaning was clear. She hadn't been reckless. She had been protecting what was theirs. Samuel's anger melted into something else, a rush of respect, and a jolt of understanding. In that moment he saw her not as a mistake thrust upon him, but as a partner, someone who acted without hesitation to save what mattered. She had crossed an ocean for a promise, and now, in the middle of a prairie storm, she was risking herself to guard their small world. He reached out and touched her arm, this time gently. "Thank you," he said, voice low but steady. "Thank you." She blinked, then gave a small nod, water dripping from her hair. For a long moment they just looked at each other while the storm raged outside. After the worst passed, they worked side by side to secure the rest of the animals and cover the damaged coop. Mud clung to their boots and wind still gusted, but there was no hesitation between them. He handed her tools. She anticipated his next move. They moved like two halves of one effort. When at last they returned to the house, exhausted and dripping, Samuel stoked the fire while Maylene brewed tea from the small tin she kept on the shelf. She poured 2 cups, set one in front of him, and for the first time said his name clearly. "Samuel." He looked up. "Yes," he said softly. Something had shifted. The storm outside had forced them together, but the storm inside him, the doubt, the resistance had broken too. He realized that whatever papers arrived from the agency, whatever the neighbors said, the woman across from him was no longer just a stranger. She was part of his life, part of his fight, part of his home. As thunder rolled away across the plains, leaving the air washed and clean, Samuel felt an unfamiliar but welcome certainty settle in his chest. The choice he'd been postponing had already been made in the mud and wind of the storm. They would face whatever came next together. The storm left the prairie washed in a strange, glimmering light. Puddles mirrored the vast sky, and the scent of wet earth rose heavy and sweet. Samuel and Maylene stood on the porch the next morning, watching a rainbow form faintly over the hills. The ranch, though battered, still stood. Chickens clucked nervously but alive. The cattle grazed in the distance, and Ranger slept curled in a dry patch of sun. Inside the house, everything smelled of damp wood and soap. Maylene had opened the windows to let the air flow through, and she hummed softly to herself as she hung fresh clothes by the hearth to dry. Samuel sat at the table, running a cloth over his boots. For the first time in months, he felt not just relief but a steady calm. The storm had shaken more than the buildings. It had shaken loose his uncertainty. Later that day, Samuel saddled 2 horses. When Mei Lin stepped outside, he offered her the reins to the gentler mare. She looked startled but pleased, running her hand along the animal's neck. "Ride?" she asked, her accent soft but the meaning clear. "Ride," he confirmed with a smile. They set off at a slow walk across the plains. The sky was enormous, the grass swaying in waves. Samuel showed her the edges of his land, pointing out landmarks. The stream where he watered the herd, the grove of cottonwoods where his parents were buried, the ridge where you could see 3 counties at once. She listened intently, eyes following his gestures even if she caught only some of the words. Now and then she repeated a name, trying it on her tongue. They stopped by the stream where water gurgled over smooth stones. Samuel pulled a folded paper from his coat, a reply from the agency that had arrived the evening before. At first he hadn't known how to show it to her, but now, after the storm, he felt ready. He handed it over. Mei Lin unfolded it carefully. The letter, in clumsy English, apologized for the mix-up. Elizabeth had married someone else. Mei Lin had been reassigned without Samuel's consent. The agency offered either to arrange for her return or, if Samuel wished, to formalize their union properly with papers and a marriage certificate. She read slowly, lips moving over the words she could understand. When she looked up, her eyes searched his. He took a deep breath. "You don't have to stay," he said softly, pointing first to the horizon, then to himself. "But and if you want—" He touched his chest. "Here, with me." For a moment, the only sound was the stream and the breeze in the grass. Then Mei Lin smiled, not the shy, uncertain smile of the early days, but one bright and steady. She touched the paper, then pointed to herself and to him. "Together," she said in clear, careful English. Samuel felt his throat tighten. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. The world around them seemed wider and softer all at once. When they rode back to the ranch, the sun was low, painting everything gold. Samuel saw the house not as a lonely outpost, but as a beginning. The curtains Mei Lin had hung fluttered at the windows. Inside waited the kettle, the dog, the promise of supper. It wasn't the future he had imagined months ago, but it was theirs, hard-won, uncertain, but alive. That evening, as they sat on the porch with Ranger at their feet, Samuel spoke slowly, teaching her new English words: sky, home, hope. She repeated each one, laughing softly at her own mistakes. Then she taught him a few of her own words in return, the syllables unfamiliar but warm. The exchange felt like planting seeds. Above them, the prairie stretched endless and wild, but within the small circle of light on their porch, something had changed. They were no longer 2 strangers bound by error and circumstance. They were partners, learning each other's languages, building a life with their own hands. For the first time since he'd sent that fateful letter months ago, Samuel no longer felt like a man waiting. He felt like a man living, and beside him, Mei Lin no longer looked like a woman lost, but a woman arriving. The wind carried their voices out into the dusk, mingling with the cry of night birds. It was the sound of a new beginning, fragile, imperfect, but real.